Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me today on the Minimalist Moms podcast.
I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so excited to talk about your new book, Habits for a Sacred Home. But before we get there, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the listeners?
Oh, it's so nice to meet you all. I'm Jennifer Pepito, and I have 7 children. I've been married for 34 years. I live in the kind of mountains of California, and I'm just thrilled to get to share my love for habits and my love for parenting with the world through my Peaceful Press resources and my books, Mothering by the Book and Habits for a Sacred Home.
Yes. Okay. The subtitle of your book is Nine Practices from History to Anchor and Restore Modern Families. For me, I do like to look to the past. Not everything from the past is the best way to be. There's some things that we've overcome as a society, which is for the benefit of all of us. But there's some things that we're getting wrong, I'll say, as a blanket statement. But I think often it's important to look to the past and it's like a simpler time to know how to move forward. So before we get into those nine practices, I want to know what prompted you to write about this topic.
Yeah, I was actually feeling kind of concerned about the world with COVID and the way there was a lot of crazy stuff happening. And and so as I was watching that, I was also reading books about history and reading books about people how people handle difficult times in history. And I recognized that some of the monks had also lived through really difficult times. And I'm not Catholic, but I was really fascinated by the lives of these ancient saints and the way they navigated the dark ages, partly by just doing the normal, everyday, healthy things that humanity should do. Things like eating a meal around a table together or having a balance of work and rest. Or, for us, prayer is kind of one of our essential habits. And so as I saw how these monks lived these lives of simplicity and beauty, even while the world was in chaos, I was inspired that what we're doing as moms is just as formative and restorative for our culture as what they were doing 1,500 years ago.
So that's the why behind why you chose to write this. And now I want to get into the nine practices, which I don't know if you want to do an overview of what the nine are, and then we can go into some application. However, you want to move forward. Would you like to share some of them or maybe some of your favorite practices?
Yeah, for sure. So the practices are simplicity, hospitality, stability, community, order, work, prayer, and balance. And wait,
Mm,
there's one more. I just went to 8. Each one of these habits, some of them almost feel like they kind of overlap, like hospitality and community. But if you don't show hospitality, you actually won't build deep and abiding community. And, if you
uh,
don't have some simplicity, it's hard to have stability in your life. So they kind of all go together in a sense, even something as simple as work, where work might feel like sort of a drudgery, sort of a habit. But every good thing, even, beautiful creative things like art or making our homes more beautiful or
mhm.
taking care of our spiritual lives, that takes work. It takes not just going with the flow, but actually having an intention and following through on it. So, yeah, each one of the habits has, just a different sort of set of habits that they're almost like values that are overarching, and then each value has a set of habits that are built into that.
So, how old is your oldest child? You said you've been married for 35 years, right?
Yeah, 34 years married in September, and my oldest
Okay.
is 30 and my youngest is 15.
Okay. So, I'm looking for real life application in your own life about how these practices have anchored your guys' family. And I think when we look at something like, oh, these nine new practices, or I don't even know where to start because my family's been in chaos, or maybe it just doesn't seem attainable. Where practically did you start when you first started implementing these? I'm assuming this was years ago and that's why you're writing about it because you're the expert now. But I guess what did this look like for you?
Yeah, and, I remembered the missing habit that I forgot to mention it in its order, and I think in some
Order.
ways that is where you start, because this was the hardest chapter for me to write because I'm a modern person who, just like many modern people, is very skeptical of institutions and skeptical of, the damage done by overbearing systems of authority and things like that. And yet, if we don't acknowledge ourselves as under authority, like in my case, under the authority of scripture, then it makes it really hard to accomplish anything in life or to have any wisdom about what to say yes to and what to say no to. And I've mentioned this a lot. I took a Tish Oxenreider Rule of Life course recently, and she said that our purpose as humans is to say yes to God. And that was so helpful for me because it's like the beginning of living a life of more purpose or creating to me, a sacred home is more of it's a consecrated home. It's a home where we acknowledge that we're living for a higher purpose. And the beginning of that is just acknowledging that we're living for a higher purpose, that there's another value system that I'm not just living to, please myself or please my family. I'm as much as I want to have a happy, peaceful home, that is not my ultimate goal. My ultimate goal really is to live a life that's surrendered to God. And so each one of these habits actually sort of equip and sustain me in that life of surrender to God. And so I think the first thing really is to decide, like, who do you want to live for? What do you want to live for? What is your overarching value? And one of the things that we've done in our restoration home community, and that I've done that's been a foundational habit for me, is knowing my why, like knowing what I'm about. And part of what helped me with that was reading all these biographies, because in Habits for a Sacred Home, I highlight the lives of 9 different women of faith and the way that they lived, the way that they impacted the world through their faithfulness. People like Edith Schaefer and Ruth Bell Graham, and lesser known women such as Ella Tweeton or, maybe Sabina Wurmbrand. And so each one of these women lived with such integrity in their daily lives. They didn't set out to be famous at all, but many of them became quite renowned. Like Edith Schaefer was the mother of Susan Schaefer Macaulay, who's written some of our, favorite books on family and homeschooling. And so each one of these women contributed to culture in grand ways where they just set out to be faithful in the little things, faithful in caring for their children, faithful in caring for their home, faithful in loving their neighbors. And so I think that as we start to develop a vision, and some of that comes with knowing about great people and looking at how people have lived lives of exemplary character, then it gives us something to work towards. Whereas I think sometimes in culture today, there's so few great examples of like a wonderful mother or wonderful humans that we can be a little bit lost about what to shoot for.
Absolutely. And obviously, this is going to look different for every family. Like you said, whatever it is that we value the most. But I think for me, trying to pursue a more intentional lifestyle, it really is about quieting the noise and not bringing everything in, because I homeschool my oldest as well. And I think that there's just so many opportunities, and it's like, oh, we could join this co op on this day and we could do this co op on this day. But it's like, actually, we value slow and we value margin. And that's something that I didn't realize how much I really needed. And so it's really narrowing that focus for us. So again, how have you quieted the noise and really created that simplistic atmosphere? I know you said simplicity is one of your pillars or one of the habits.
Yeah, and I think it really, because I knew what my values were. Like, I early on as a family, we ask, "What are your core values and essentials?" And I wrote that down really early as a mom, and my core values and essentials were time in nature, hospitality, growing a garden, simple living, and worship and world missions. And so because those essentials were written down very early, it actually was like a hedge for me to keep me from overscheduling our family. Like, it's so important to me to be able to get out and go to the river with my kids. So I will not engage in activities that are like daily, making us all worn out. It's so important to me that we have a healthy nervous system. So I will not, spend a lot of time in malls or driving in traffic or things like that. So knowing my essentials has really made it easier to make those day-to-day choices. And that's one of the things I talk a lot about in Habits for a Sacred Home, is just that we have to know, like, what we're working towards, and kind of like understand what sort of a civilized life looks like, because I think so many people have gotten used to just being on their phone and then getting in the car to go somewhere and then shopping on their phone and then eating on their phone and just having no kind of a life at all, that we almost can't even envision what a peaceful, intentional, integrated life looks like.
Wanting to know more about you, there were seasons for you. I'm sure right now is a busy season. You're launching this book into the world. So I understand that busy will come and go. But do you ever feel like there was a season for you that was full of overwhelm, and what did you turn to, or how did you get yourself out of that?
Yeah, I love that question, because I just talked last night in my restoration home community about the importance of stability. And often when we are in one of those seasons that are overwhelming, we can start to make some really bad decisions that make our lives a lot harder. But I know for one of those seasons, we owned a 5-acre kind of little farm in a way, and I had made the decision to buy that farm in a bad season. My oldest daughter was having some challenges. My husband was working out of town. And so we made the decision to buy this property in a bad season. And then we were stuck in this situation where the house had tons of problems. The property was overwhelming to take care of. It was causing a lot of family conflict. And finally, like, we slogged away there for several years, and some great character traits came out of that. We learned some things about ourselves, but finally we sold that and, bought a house with less acreage and less to take care of so that we could have, well, live more by our values. Because as much as my value is to live a simple life or grow some of our own food, a bigger value for me is to have time with my children and time with the Lord. And so what I found myself doing in this particular season was just spending a lot of time yelling at my kids, like, did you do this yet? Did you haul that wheelbarrow load of mulch? Did you pull those weeds? Like, it was just a constant heavy burden of work that created a lot of disconnection because my kids started hiding from me. And so, I think that we do have to make decisions slowly. Like, I think that's part of being more of an essentialist or a minimalist, is just not jumping into things. Like, you think, yes, I want to simplify my life, but make the big decisions just a little bit slower, because often when we're in a really uncomfortable space, we'll make snap decisions that will actually put us, from the frying pan into the fire, essentially.
Yes, absolutely. I can relate to that. We moved to 3 acres back in the fall, and it was kind of, I don't think I've ever really talked about this on the show. It was kind of just like a serendipitous God-led thing where it was like, "Okay, we aren't quite ready to move, but this is a kind of a once in a lifetime situation that we were finding ourselves in. Let's just pull the trigger." I think I've mourned a little bit of our old house because it was smaller and it was more convenient, but yeah, that's just a side note. But all that to say, it was a lot of different challenges that we were finding at that time, and I was like, "I'm gonna cut my hair. I'm gonna dye it. I'm gonna dye my hair." And my friend was like, "Diane, you are in the middle of a season of change right now. Do not add to it. Do not make decisions under duress. It's good to wait for a moment." So I think we do have to really remember that sometimes, I don't know. And I think the more that we pray or in tune with the spirit, that we'll have clarity, but sometimes we don't. And I think if it seems chaotic or you have any hesitation, you probably should pause. Even if it's for a week, you should just take pause.
Yeah, I think that's so good, Diane, because we do often make more trouble for ourselves when we make, like, we're having a bad homeschool week. And so we put the kids in school. We're having a bad week with our kids in school. We pull them out. Like, when we make decisions during a stressful season, instead of just pushing through. And I love that analogy of the bison. The bison put their heads down and they walk through the storm, whereas the cows like scatter or try to run away from it. And they end up being in the storm longer because they don't just push through. And so I think as moms, like, our peace is so crucial to our children's peace. Like, I cannot overemphasize how important our own way of being is to the peace of our family. And so if we don't make slow decisions so that we're thoughtful, like, well, how will this impact my children? How will this impact my relationship with my husband? Because every decision has its own, like, ripple effect or domino effect of other things that are going to be connected to it. And so moving a little slower even as you implement hopeful change, like, don't try to start with revamping your whole home all at once. Start with just adding one new habit. Start with just your morning routine. Start with just cleaning your kitchen before you go to bed. Get one habit going, and then you can add another one. Just, we work on 1% improvement, like James Clear talks about in Atomic Habits.
So I know you talked about how important order is, and I would say, yes, God is a God of order, and our house should be in order. My husband is always a little bit overwhelmed when the house is chaotic because I think he's more of an orderly person than I am. I think I can exist in a little bit more chaos, but I definitely strive for order. All that to say, you have these 9 women that you looked back to the past and researched and got their wisdom, took their wisdom to apply to now. Do you have a few favorites that you want to share with us? Not just like what they brought to this book, but just their stories in general?
Yeah, I mean, partly for sure, Edith Schaefer would be at the top of that list. Like, she was just so creative and such a hard worker. I mean, they were living in Europe, they were hosting people all the time. She was trying to be like an intellectual person, have thoughtful conversations while also cooking for 40 people every day, you know. So I just love the way she exemplified, being a woman, just being a creative woman, loving your children, but not feeling limited by that. And so she's such an inspiration. Another one is Ruth Bell Graham. Like, her family just consistently said about her that she was so cheerful and fun and playful. And I think that is such an important component that often intentional moms like ourselves don't emphasize enough. Like, we're so concerned about doing things right and doing things the best way. And we don't recognize how powerful just being a joyful person is in our home. It makes our children and our husband more responsive to us. It creates a happier atmosphere, makes it easier for our kids to learn. And so, not taking ourselves too seriously. And I think Ruth Bell Graham really exemplified that. And then also, I really appreciate Madeline L'Engle because, I have been a Christian for a long time. I homeschooled for 26 years. And so I've seen some movements that were very legalistic and very, dogmatic in a way, and I've seen the pressure that can put on families, and it's like, yes, we want to have high ideals, and yes, we want to, raise our children for righteousness or things like that. But I mean, life is a lot messier than we think it is, and there's no guarantees. Like, so many of those families or those people who were sort of like preaching this really dogmatic way of being, like, half their kids don't even speak to them. There's a lot of chaos sometimes in the wake of that, even the Duggars, for example. And so just learning to be a little bit more hopeful and just putting your trust in God. Like Anne Lamott says, the opposite of faith is certainty. And I think that's important to note because we can feel like, oh, there's one certain way of raising our children. There's one certain right way of homeschooling. And those kinds of like dogmatic statements often set us up for failure because I don't think God likes idolatry. You know what I mean? And so if we put a system into the place of God and say, "Oh, if I do this one system, if I parent my kids this one way, it's all gonna be good." But I think all of our children are different. They have different personalities. You can't see it in scripture that one great parent parented his kids one great way and they all turned out amazing. And so I think it's better to just go on a journey with God, do your best to obey, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him and he'll direct your paths. I think having a little bit more faith, and I feel like Madeline L'Engle kind of exemplified that because there's some messiness about her faith and some imperfections, and
Mhm.
yet she had sustained faith. She continued trusting in the Lord.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I want my kids to see that in me. I think that my faith has continued to be an evolution of just understanding, not I don't use the word deconstructing. That's not the word I'm looking for, but just really making it my own because I think it is your parents when you grow up in a Christian household and just I want my kids to know like this is always a choice that you get to come back to, but I'm going to give you some of these foundations and lay it out for you to make as your own. But I do think yes, I like that about her as well. It's not perfect and it may not look like whomever, our next door neighbor, which I do want to talk. There's two more things I want to touch on. One, I want to talk about the word sacred home. Did we hash out what you mean by the word sacred?
No, and I'm glad you asked because I think sometimes people say, "Oh, I can't have a perfect home," or they think of sacred as being like a church where everything is perfect and in its place and it's really clean and quiet. But that's actually not the meaning of it. The meaning of sacred is consecrated. And so, for myself, like I am a believer, everything I own and everything I do is for the Lord. So I'm a sacred person in a sacred home. And I think that when we make that switch and just think about it more as a consecration, like my home, my children, we're consecrated to God. We're going to do our best to cultivate, sacred spaces or consecrated spaces. But it's not about perfection or having a home that's like there's Gregorian chants on all the time or it's all candle lit and peaceful and perfect. It's just more about the attitude of your heart.
Yes, absolutely. Because I do think that word can I love it. I think it's beautiful and I think there's a richness to that word. And then there's a richness to all these stories. So I think it's a perfect title for your book. But I think it can be intimidating to be like, "Oh my gosh, this is a sacred space. I can't scream at my kids. I can't do this and that. And then you have this remorse because you haven't kept that. But I like how we did talk about this a little bit at the beginning, just those everyday tasks that we can do to keep our home sacred. And it might just be playing on the ground with our kids, which I am not the best ground player. I'm more of like an experiential type mom. But even something like that without a phone, like that is keeping the space sacred and pure for raising kids. So I don't know. I don't have any question, just comment.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you can relate to it because it's true. I mean, we'd all love to have a place that is our ideal of sacred, like being so peaceful and so present. But the reality is that young children are need responding to, and they're all different. And I've had kids with special needs. I've had kids who had some sensory issues. I've had a lot of little boys all at once. Like I had three young boys in a row, and boys can sometimes seem like the opposite of sacred because they're so busy and messy and they love to go roll in the mud and fight each other. But they're still little beings that are consecrated to God that deserve our love and our care. And I think that's more about what we're cultivating is just a home where love and peace reign because of the attitude of our heart.
Yes, absolutely. I know we're almost to a half hour here, but I really want to touch on one, the balance of community. I was just talking to my sister in law. She has a newborn and she is going to be a working mom. And she's like, I don't know how I'm going to balance it all, which I mean, that in itself seems overwhelming. But it's like, what does it look like in the season to balance hospitality and community when we do have a lot going on? I have a lot going on. So, yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah, and I think that part of it is just not being a perfectionist about it. Do you know what I mean? Because we do need people. Like we need to be with people. I know when I was in the early years of motherhood and I was pregnant, if I was sat at home all day, I often felt like the worst. I would feel so awful. But if I would get myself dressed and get my kids dressed and go to a park with a friend, I could forget about how awful I felt for a little while. And so I feel like we really have to have community as we're in the stages of parenting. It's like accountability, it's people to pray for you. And, for some people right now, it is more of an online, we can end up having more of an online community and that can be helpful. But we also do need to have at least one or two good friends who can come over anytime, who aren't going to be scared by the mess in your house, who you can just make it something like, hey, let's go for a quick half-hour walk while my husband puts the kids to bed. Or, hey, let's put the kids in the stroller and go for a walk. Like there's so many ways to do community without having a perfect home. And I think those early years, they are intense on a household. Like I don't have that many people to do laundry for, and I still have a basket of unfolded laundry on my washing machine. And in those days when all 7 children were home, I mean, it was constant. There was constantly, laundry on the couch or laundry piled up on my bed. Like it is intense trying to manage our homes and keep things beautiful. And so having just a little bit of a lower standard in some ways so that people are above the atmosphere as much as I believe in, a beautiful atmosphere. I'm a huge believer in the power of atmosphere, even for educating, like having a house plant in your house, not having too many toys. And that's part of it too, is like, don't spend a lot of time shopping in this season because you will think that you need more pillows or you need more clothes for your kids. But often it's the stuff management that really steals time from being present and having that space that's peaceful and that is, related or oriented towards relationships. So you don't need, like, your house doesn't need to be perfectly decorated in this time. Having a bouquet of flowers or a house plant or, just the minimum of kind of uh, belongings is going to really contribute towards that more peaceful and sacred home.
I do like what you said at the beginning of all of that, just allowing people to come alongside of us with some of the monotony or things that we're doing. I definitely have the friends that like, hey, I'm gonna clean while you're here and you can just follow me around and we'll have a conversation. But that's what it looks like in this season. And it may not look like some of your friends that are further ahead in their motherhood journey or that don't have kids yet. And you cannot compare because it really is about your unique family dynamic.
Yeah, and I think, the more you get in the habit of just paring down your belongings, the more peaceful your life's gonna be in the long run. Because, like, for me even, I love cultivating and curating a really rich library. But this
Mhm.
week, I've spent a lot of time, weeding through the books and weeding through the belongings because, we've lived in the same house for 7 years. The stuff starts to pile up. But I think just really being thoughtful before you bring something to your home. Is it something you really need
Yeah.
and is going to add to your atmosphere?
Yes, and you can listen to my show and do that for sure. That's why I'm here. I think there was one more thing I want to touch on. You can touch on it briefly, but having a sacred home, cultivating that here and taking out into the world, especially for me in a homeschool co-op, if it's not spiritual, it's more secular. I think just how do we preserve this, but also be open to arm to people that don't believe the same way that we do?
I think a lot comes through just our way of being. You know what I mean? Like when we are a more peaceful person or a person of faith, I think so often it does come through in the way that we do life and people are attracted to it. And if people aren't attracted to you, then it might be something to kind of pray through or journal about. Like, are am I living according to my ideals? I was talking to a friend who she lives in a town and there's a big homeschool co-op, but she said that the kids there are weird. And then I was
Mhm.
trying to probe a little bit more and it's like it's a very, legalistic, maybe kind of dogmatic group and they're not friendly to her kids. They aren't nice to her kids even. And so it's like they might have a godly value of modesty or something, but if they then are do not have the godly value of kindness or humility or mercy, then actually they're probably not that godly. Like they might dress well, but they don't necessarily have a godly way of living or being. And so I think, sometimes we can get tripped up on what it means to be a person of faith or to live as a person of faith. And I think it's a lot more about what's happening. Like, are we connected to God and living in an overflow of being loved by God? Or are we living to prove ourselves to God and others? And I think that really changes a lot about our way of being because for me, as a younger mom, I was often trying to prove myself and trying to like get people to like me and act in a way that I thought would produce, like, respect in a way or that would sort of I would escape judgment in a sense. And, I had through a series of events, I had to suffer some humiliation. Like, some of my kids, like, I had a daughter who had an eating disorder, I had a child with learning disabilities, like, these kinds of things tear down this sort of perfectionist parenting thing that I could sort of try to project, and it made me realize, "Oh my gosh, like, I cannot get my identity from the behavior of my children. That is a that is a tumbling castle." And so I
Yeah.
had to start to recognize it. "Oh, my identity is in Christ alone. It's not my work, but his work." And so then I can just live like, I don't have to judge everybody and decide who's right and who's wrong because that's God's job. I can
Mhm.
instead be loving, be kind, try to live a godly, righteous life myself, but I don't have to
Mhm.
live as the arbiter of judgment of everybody around me.
Yes, I had to come to that conclusion during 2020 because I was so focused on what everyone else was doing. And then I just had an epiphany where it was like, just stay in your lane. Kind of what you were saying, you supplement one sin for another. It's like we don't notice we have blinders on our own behaviors and we don't realize that that too is not a good thing. And so I think that one of the things in creating a sacred household for us is just really being focused on what we could always be doing better and not in a like an oppressive way, but it's just like, hey guys, yes, they were rude to you, but let's keep in our own lane. That's their weight to bear. It wasn't nice. Maybe don't hang out with them if they continue to do this, but how can you be better? And I don't know, just I try very hard to just stay in my own lane now and allow people to make the choices that they want to make. And we're just here in our little family unit doing the ones that we value, if that makes sense.
I think it's wise because we can, live the life that we want people to live. And if it's a blessing, they will want to live or follow our
Mhm.
example. It's like Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. But
Mhm.
if we're constantly focused on trying to get other people to do something different or control people, we're going to be
Mhm.
emotionally worn down and
Yep.
probably not be very effective. Like, as people of faith, where you
Mhm.
want people to experience the joy of the Lord. If we don't have any joy, and if we're not really living as people of hope and faith, then people aren't going to be attracted to that anyhow. So.
Yes, no, absolutely. Well, Jennifer, I think this was a great conversation. Where can listeners connect with you if they want to hear more from you online and on your podcast?
Yeah, if you go to habitsforasacredhome.com, you can order the book through many different retailers there. And if you put your order number in, you'll get access to my Peaceful Life workshop. And then I'm also on the peacefulpress.shop for my homeschool resources, and then I'm on Instagram at Jennifer Pepito.
Perfect. Well, as we wrap things up, just quickly, rapid fire, I'm going to ask you two final questions. The first one is, what's been a beneficial resource in your life that you want to share with the listeners?
I love that question. And, lately I've been watching some short YouTube videos, anything from like a Francis Chan sermon to some Abby Gamboa worship to there's a lady named Laura Doyle who talks a lot about marriage. So that probably YouTube lately has been one of my favorite resources.
I feel like I don't even watch TV anymore. It's either podcasts or YouTube. So I'm right there with
Okay.
you. Yeah. All right. My last question is, what is something that you can't stop talking about?
Probably Jesus. Like, I'm working right now on keeping a gratitude journal, and it's been so good for me to I read a book called The 4 Habits of Happy Joy-Filled People, I think it was called. And so that has started me doing daily gratitude journal. And in that journaling process, I also kind of take time to write down like how I feel like Jesus feels about me today, or something I feel like he wants me to do today. And just doing working at staying connected to the Lord, because I feel like so much of my angsty or dysregulated behaviors comes out of sometimes a search for love. Like, we as humans have a hole in our heart. And if I stay connected to God, the hole is filled up and I act like a more normal person with my family. Whereas if I'm looking at social media or my kids or my husband or anything in the world to try and make me feel good about myself or like a human or whole or purposeful, I think we end up getting into error. So definitely just my faith in the Lord and my time with the Lord is something I probably can't stop talking about.
I think that's a great thing to not be able to stop talking about. So I just appreciate you joining me, Jennifer, and I love this book. It's so great. I like I said, I love looking to the past on ways to live now. So much wisdom to glean. So thanks for gathering all this research for us and putting it in your book and for joining me today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Diane. I so appreciate you taking the time to chat.